Imagine you collapse on a busy street. Hundreds of people walk past you. Not one stops. Not because they are cruel, not because they don't care, but because of something buried so deep in your brain that you don't even know it's happening. That's not a hypothetical. That's what science has proven happens to you. And the real reason is far stranger than anyone wants to admit. On March 13, 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her apartment in New York City. The assault lasted over half an hour. 38 neighbors reportedly witnessed some part of it. Almost none of them called the police. The story shocked the nation, and it launched one of the most important and disturbing lines of research in the history of psychology, because what the researchers discovered wasn't that those 38 people were monsters. What they discovered was that those people were you. Your brain is not wired the way you think it is. You believe that in a crisis, you would act. You believe that if you saw someone drowning, collapsing, screaming for help, you would be the one who stepped forward. But study after study reveals a very different picture. And the gap between who you think you are and how you actually behave is wider than almost any other area of human psychology. The phenomenon has a name. Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané coined it in 1968. They called it the Bystander Effect. And the core finding is this: the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely any one of them is to help. Read that again. Not more likely. Less likely. In their first major experiment, Darley and Latané had participants sit in separate rooms and communicate through an intercom. One of the voices they heard was a Confederate, a fake participant planted by the researchers. That voice began having what sounded like a seizure. When subjects believed they were the only one listening, 85% of them immediately left the room to get help. When they believed 5 other people were also listening, only 31% helped. The rest sat there, doing nothing, waiting. Why? What was happening inside them? 2 things. The first is something called diffusion of responsibility. When you're alone, the weight of acting, or not acting, sits entirely on your shoulders. You feel it. Your brain registers it. But the moment other people are present, that weight gets spread across the group. Unconsciously, automatically, without a single deliberate thought, your brain does a calculation. Someone else will handle it. Your share of the responsibility drops, and with it, your urgency to act. The second thing is social proof. Your brain is constantly reading the people around you to figure out how to behave. This is not weakness. This is ancient. For hundreds of thousands of years, watching what others did in uncertain situations was a survival strategy. If the group ran, you ran. If the group stayed calm, you stayed calm. The group's behavior was data. Critical, life-saving data. But that same ancient system, the one that kept your ancestors alive, is exactly what paralyzes you on a crowded subway platform when someone falls. You look around. No one is moving. Your brain reads the stillness of the crowd as information. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought. Maybe someone already called for help. Maybe I'm overreacting. And so you freeze, not from cruelty, from an ancient cognitive shortcut that no longer fits the world you live in. This is what psychologists call pluralistic ignorance. Everyone in the crowd is privately alarmed, but everyone is also looking at everyone else and seeing calm faces. So everyone concludes, incorrectly, that the others must know something they don't. The crisis must not be real, and the group, as a whole, does nothing, while each individual, alone, would have acted. The experiments that followed Darley and Latané's original work are almost impossible to stop reading. In one study, participants were filling out a questionnaire in a room when smoke began pouring in under the door. When alone, 75% of people reported the smoke within 2 minutes. When sitting with 2 other people who were trained to ignore the smoke and act unconcerned, only 10% reported it. The room filled with smoke. People kept filling out their questionnaires. Because no one else was reacting, they convinced themselves, against all physical evidence, that nothing was wrong. Your brain would rather trust the crowd than your own senses. Think about that. Researcher Stanley Milgram, already famous for his obedience experiments, spent years studying urban behavior and found that the bystander effect intensifies in cities. Not because city people are colder or less empathetic, but because the sheer density of people, the constant presence of others, means the diffusion of responsibility is almost always in effect. There is always someone else. There is always a reason not to be the one. But here is where it gets more complicated, because the bystander effect is not the whole story, and the research that came after Darley and Latané adds layers that most people never hear about. Peter Fisher and his colleagues at the University of Regensburg published a major analysis in 2011. They reviewed over 50 studies on the bystander effect and found something critical. When the danger is clear and unambiguous, the bystander effect weakens dramatically. When people can see that someone is in immediate physical danger, not just distress, not just confusion, but real, visible danger, the crowd's paralysis breaks. Not always, not perfectly, but significantly. What this tells you is that the bystander effect is not a fixed law. It's a tendency, a default setting. And like every default setting in your brain, it can be overridden, but only if you know it's there. Because the cruelest part of this phenomenon is that it operates below your awareness. You don't feel yourself diffusing responsibility. You feel yourself reading the situation. You feel yourself being rational, careful, not wanting to overreact. The very act of falling into the bystander effect feels, from the inside, like good judgment, which is why the most important tool researchers discovered isn't empathy, it isn't bravery, it isn't even moral training. It's knowledge, simply knowing that the bystander effect exists, knowing that the crowd's inaction is not evidence that everything is fine, measurably increases the chance that you will act. There's a practical technique that emergency response trainers teach specifically because of this research. If you're ever in a crowd and someone needs help, don't shout for anyone to call for help. Point at one specific person. Make eye contact. Say, "You in the red jacket, call an ambulance now." The moment you individualize the request, you collapse the diffusion of responsibility. You make one person fully accountable, and that person almost always acts. Darley and Latané knew this. They built a framework around it. The first step toward helping in any emergency isn't courage. It's noticing, recognizing that something is actually wrong. The second step is interpreting it as an emergency, rather than letting the crowd's calm convince you otherwise. The third step is taking personal responsibility, rather than assuming someone else will. These sound obvious, but each step is a place where the bystander effect can intercept you quietly, without your knowledge, and route you toward inaction. Social psychologist Philip Zimbardo, who spent decades studying how ordinary people do extraordinary things, good and terrible, argued that heroism is less about character and more about situation. The people who act in emergencies are often not braver than the people who don't. They are simply less infected by diffusion at that particular moment. They happen to be closest. They happen to have the clearest view. They happen to be in a situation where they felt more individually accountable. What this means is both humbling and strangely hopeful. You are not immune to this. No one is. The 38 neighbors who heard Kitty Genovese were not exceptional in their failure. They were ordinary people in a situation that exploited a universal feature of human cognition. The same feature that lives in you, in me, in everyone who has ever stood in a crowd and assumed that someone else would handle it. But the research also shows that the effect can be broken. Deliberately, consciously, by something as simple as a direct look and a pointed finger, by choosing to interpret the crowd's silence as data about the bystander effect rather than data about the emergency, by knowing, really knowing in a moment of crisis, that the calm on other people's faces is not evidence that you're wrong to be alarmed. Tonight, you'll move through the world in the company of other people. On buses, in stores, in restaurants, in streets. And if something happens, if someone needs help, your brain will do what it always does. It will look around. It will read the crowd. It will start to diffuse. Now you know what that feeling is, and now you know that you don't have to follow it. The next time you feel that ancient instinct telling you that someone else will handle it, that's not a fact about the situation. That's your brain running an old program in a world it wasn't built for. The 38 neighbors didn't fail Kitty Genovese because they were cruel. They failed her because no one told them what was happening inside their own heads. You don't have that excuse anymore.